A, the chair is coming. Due to the lack of procedure around whether the chair turns up or not, in 3 minutes I take over. Shoot timer. One more.
name is Marjan.
I'm Jacob, and I didn't mind.
My name is Fardin. Preferred pronoun he.
My name is Dawson. Preferred pronoun he.
Yeah, my name is Micah. She or they.
JP's here.
They are. She.
Dragoshi. Dragoshi the extension.
Sorry?
Dragoshi doing the extension. I can't remember. If you are noting the order,
Oh, okay.
it's the other way.
Cool. Okay. Yep.
Hi everyone, Edwin taking first for he.
Evan speaking second. Prefer she. Like that.
Are we waiting for someone as well?
The
Yeah,
training
we
judge.
we don't know who they are though. Maybe effective feedback. I'm not sure. Okay.
The keeper.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They said they would.
Alright. Oh.
I just got one.
Okay.
Chair, please. Okay, I'll just. One chair. Yeah, thank you. Let's go. Yes.
Okay, do you want to reintroduce yourself and tell us your pronouns?
Chesky.
Alright. Okay, so we better get started now. As you know, taking points of information between 1 minute and 6 minutes. Okay, so I'd like to invite. Oh, and you go to chair. Yeah? Alright, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to begin this debate.
Madam Speaker, in a world full of conflict that's rife everywhere, the need to have a military presence which is efficient and equal in terms of quality and efficiency everywhere is paramount, to make sure that every conflict that takes place doesn't get drowned away through any sort of compromise in quality or politicization of a decision that prevents proper efficacy of intervention in those particular places. We think in today's world, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Africa, whether it's operations in Europe and anywhere else, dealing with rogue states or insurgents or any sort of organization such as this has become a complex procedure which we need to engage on all fronts. We think thus, the need to expand the wing of the military and include these mercenaries for greater efficiency and pay attention to resolve conflicts on a much more wider scale is extremely necessary. But we're also going to talk to you about how the minute we make this a military intervention without the involvement of these mercenaries, it actually compromises our efficiency, and the involvement of these mercenaries can help create better solutions. So understand this. What happens when it's just a military intervention under current status quo and it doesn't involve the mercenaries? Why does this need come about? Because the minute it's just a military intervention from one country to another, through that country's army being the only form of modus operandi, we think the states become bigger according to the perception of the people and according to the perception of all the stakeholders. So that's when problems and conflicts, which needed quick solutions or which needed efficient military engagement and combat within those particular fronts, actually become bigger and more demonized through media or more exasperated through media, and brings in more and more stakeholders into the whole context, and that's actually harmful. Because we think something like an intervention into Syria to stop a dictator from using chemical weapons turned into stopping about being about the evil dictator using chemical weapons to kill people, but it became about what's happening in terms of the UN conflict between America and Russia. It becomes about the political gambits, it becomes about the red tape, it becomes about that, and that's exactly how people demonize these sort of processes. People doubt the legitimacy of these sort of actions, and the actions are slowed down and these actions are prevented. And thus even the military feels these extra burdens, they feel the pressure of these political motives, and this exasperates and harms the whole process. Thus a change needs to be made. Yes?
How does any of that change with the United States employing this company to fight your war?
Right, exactly. So the minute you have an expansion of the wing of your military and involve mercenaries in, we think it becomes far better. Because we think according to the perception of the people, everything is different when it's the US telling you that our troops are going in. But we think mercenaries are different. Mercenaries are people for whom this is their profession, for whom the tie is not to the nationalistic identity of the flag they're representing, but about the mission and the call of duty they've been particularly given. We think involving these mercenaries with a specific mission and a specific task is likely to succeed, because the decision-making process here is less politicized. There's less likelihood of this becoming a political gambit, or less likelihood of other people that influence this decision. It becomes less about why the US is going in and less about what the US will do there and all of the things, but becomes about bringing about the solution or impact that we need to change. So this expansion of efficiency is extremely needed. At the same time, in today's world, we think we make priority calls based on the conflicts that we see. When the Islamic State becomes a problem, we try to sweep under the rug the atrocities of Boko Haram or the atrocities of Al-Shabaab, and we send our best troops and our best mission and all our focus and all our media airtime and everything towards the bigger conflict that's currently in picture, and others get swept under the rug, even though thousands and thousands of lives are being lost there on a daily basis. Within a minute, you have an expansion of wing and include mercenaries. You get to compete efficiently on all of those fronts, and that's extremely important. At the same time, the minute there are mercenaries who can carry out things like covert ops or special operations on their own and go into these countries without that fear of politicization or without the fear of an extra burden of belonging to the army, you can break through a lot of things and bring about several unique benefits. One of the biggest benefits these mercenaries can bring through in contrast to our army is breaking through bureaucracy and red tape, which is significantly lessened when it's a mercenary involved. Because when 200 schoolgirls were taken away by Boko Haram, the government got a warning that this might happen, but they felt that it's not worth it to devote their army to this particular cause at this particular period, and we couldn't get it done. Or we were too caught up in things like IS and other things, and we couldn't devote that either. This mercenary gives you that extra group of people who you can devote to these sort of things and bring about a solution and preemptive prevention to problems which otherwise are become too important to ignore, which otherwise become an issue of red tape, of resource allocation, of consistent bureaucracy. At the same time, we think it helps us fight things like corruption in countries as well, and how those influence decision makings. Because we think there are multiple countries where we see clearly that there's something wrong. We think there are genocides of minorities in places like Azerbaijan or Burundi, but the state doesn't hold themselves liable. The state tries to sweep it under the rug and doesn't welcome any sort of intervention, or tries to sweep everything under the rug and tell the world that things are okay, there's nothing wrong here. We think the minute you have mercenaries and co-ops and special ops within these places, they can break through that political wrangle and go and engage on these fronts and bring about a prevention of those sort of harms as well. And it's a unique benefit brought about by the presence of these mercenaries as well. Yes?
So in order to avoid politicization, are you suggesting that we should make less visible the relationship between mercenaries and the state?
Look, but the minute there's a connection between mercenaries and state, we think there's a clear distinction between the two. The minute you're an agent of the state through military, what the military means to people and the involvement of the general people within these particular interventions makes it different, makes it more politicized and makes people more emotional and ignorant of the long-term strategic calculus that's being taken place. But mercenaries are different. They answer to the call of duty, and their duty is to bring about the quickest, efficient, productive solution within this particular compromise. And thus, we think they're on balance, it's a better comparative. Because on balance, the average US soldier will always have to wait for that particular order, or go through those political wrangles or negotiations or UN vetoes and wait for all of those things to take the swift action that was needed. We think the presence of red tape, of bureaucracy, of political wrangles stops us from going into places like Azerbaijan and preventing the death of all those people, of preventing of further not engaging against the likes of Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, because our people deem other wars to be more important, and thus as the military, we think it's more likely for us to be answerable to our people instead. It's more important to go into IS or more important to go into Iraq, but the entire world needs that some sort of help. The entire world needs some sort of engagement. They don't need our second best or third best soldiers or further political wrangle preventing those soldiers from even doing anything. They too need efficient soldiers competing on those fronts, and state can engage these mercenaries to bring about that. We think mercenaries answer to the mission, they answer to the contract that they've been given, and they have the more impetus and ability to break through political wrangles and help resolve conflict and prevent harms in all those places where we're not engaging, and it's important to protect those places too.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech, and I invite the opposition leader.
Outside opposition, we fundamentally believe that these mercenaries are not as qualified to be carrying out the missions that we send our soldiers in national armies to carry out, and we think these for several reasons, mainly that they're more likely to carry out war crimes, and this significantly decreases the ability of the national armies to carry out their missions. We think that coming out of side government, we don't really hear about who these people are, and we think that's really important to look at in terms of carrying out or getting a successful outcome for these missions. So after I go into some rebuttal, we're going to be looking at who these mercenaries are, why they're more likely to commit war crimes, and how this completely undermines our missions in a lot of countries. Okay, so first some rebuttal. There's a lot of nice rhetoric about how by using mercenaries, we're going to have more efficient solutions, we're going to all of a sudden have people focusing on Boko Haram instead of just ISIS, and we're also going to have like better special operations because these mercenaries are going to be trained in that way. Well, and also like a lack of red tape. So none of this is really fundamental, like linked or explained why this is going to happen, right? Like, why on earth, if we use mercenaries, are we going to suddenly care? Why is the media suddenly going to care about Boko Haram, right? The mercenaries themselves are hired by the national armies, right? So they're going to be waiting for the orders from those national armies. Mercenaries don't have an incentive to just go somewhere and start like making, start fighting Boko Haram on their own. They're privately hired by companies and then like hired by the state to carry out these missions. So they're also not going to be decreasing the amount of red tape that we see in these situations because they're also supposed to be waiting for orders. And if they're not going to actually be carrying out the orders of those national armies, we think that that is like an incredible flaw in terms of like the chain of command, right? So if side government's going to argue that these people are going to actually subvert the system and carry out actions on their own and like ignore bureaucracy and ignore orders, we think that that is going to be a harm overall in terms of these situations. Okay, so who are these mercenaries? We think that unfortunately what happens, the people that end up becoming mercenaries typically tend to be ex-soldiers, right? They typically tend to be people who do have experience. But the problem is that they come into this situation already with a lot of like issues in terms of like a post-traumatic stress disorder, or they've had dishonorable discharges in the armies that they were originally working for, right? We think these are like dishonorable discharges in terms of like they've abandoned their post, which puts their fellow fellow soldiers at risk. We think that's like a significant harm that you can see. Or they're more likely to have been discharged because they took action against locals in an unjustifiable way, right? They've been discharged, now they've been hired by a private company that is now going to like sell their labor to a national army. And we think that because these are the kinds of people that we see, people that are ex-soldiers because and like they're suffering from medical issues that would make them more like less reliable in the field, and also because they're less likely to be trustworthy because they have a history of dishonorable discharges. We think that presents a significant issue in this round. So that also leads me to the point of like we think they're more likely to like just commit atrocities or like act out of order in a way that significantly harms any national army's goals in terms of like actually leading towards a solution, right? We think that because of who these mercenaries are, we think they're going to delay the ability to reach a solution. So one of the reasons is like I said before, these people have been in the field for a long time. They do have combat experience. We think they're more likely to be dehumanized the whole situation, right? So we think that after years of combat, you're less likely to view the enemy as someone who deserves empathy, as someone who actually like deserves like a second chance, or like you're more likely to use force against them because you don't see them as human, right? After years and years of combat, after years of seeing these people potentially like kill your friends, right? You're more likely to see it as like a revenge motive or something like you're more likely to act out on that than a soldier who doesn't have that experience. So we think that you're more likely to like act out of line in that situation if you're a mercenary. We also think, as I said before, they're more likely to suffer from PTSD just because they've had this experience, right? Obviously, like you do have PTSD in national armies as well, but we think that the comparative is that these people, like among mercenaries, when they're not in the army, they don't have the same amount of training currently. They don't have the same kind of support currently because they're not attached officially to that army. So we think that there's like an official oversight system that overlooks a national army does not apply to these mercenaries, and therefore they're more likely to act unpredictably and not be held accountable, right? So this lack of accountability, there's no mechanism in which these mercenaries are held accountable for their actions, right? So they're not interested in the long-term trajectory of their employment by these mercenaries because they don't need to necessarily be working for this private contractor forever, right? There's like a lot of private contractors that hire mercenaries. They can easily find a job elsewhere. Additionally, there's no court-martialing system that applies to these mercenaries. So there's no specific judicial system that applies to these soldiers when they create abuses and act out of line. And so they have no internal mechanism, either through their own incentive to be continuing to be hired or in the justice system to act and follow orders in a just way. So we think that for those reasons, they're also more likely to do this. Lastly, we think they're just going to overall be less disciplined, like compared to a soldier that has like gone through like specific training, especially like a new soldier. They look up to their commanders. Someone who has more experience is more likely to question the orders that they're given. They're more likely to think they have a better idea of how to carry out the solution. We think that endangers the lives of the soldiers that we do have in these situations. And we think it also increases the likelihood that they will take action and use force against locals. That directly leads to harms that I'll be going into. I'll take back half.
So in the status quo, when atrocities occur, if the government is directly responsible, isn't there an increased incentive to cover up these crimes and make sure that they're never punished?
Well, there's actually, like, sure, but there's an incentive on both sides. There's an incentive on both sides to cover up issues, right? Because these mercenaries are still hired by the state, right? So, like, if you look at instances where we have used mercenaries, right, and this is going into my harms, right? So let's look at the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, right? 65% of the personnel involved in that scandal were mercenaries. We think that when you have a large number of people that don't have the same discipline, that don't have the same accountability, what do we see? We see them torturing, we see them humiliating prisoners illegally, right? We see them acting out of line because they don't feel like they have the same accountability that regular soldiers in the army would, right? So what we think is like, what we've seen from that is like there was a direct increase in the number of attacks against Americans after the information about Abu Ghraib, right? We saw more car bombings, right? We saw people like acting out against the U.S. because they saw how these soldiers were acting. But this was not the national army, right? But regardless of that fact, that changes how locals perceive the local army, like the official army and the official mission of the United States in this case, and it like undermines their ability to carry out their mission because they're now constantly getting attacked. And lastly, like in terms of looking looking at Abu Ghraib, there was a huge decrease in the amount of intelligence sharing between Iraq and the U.S. in terms of the war effort, because Iraq felt like it needed to show some kind of show that they were actually doing something to punish the U.S. for hiring these people in the first place, right? For hiring people that would act out so egregiously against their soldiers. So for all these reasons, especially because we're not going to be reaching the solutions that government says that we will be, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, and now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Do you have water? Sorry? Do you have water? For far too long, ladies and gentlemen, we have chosen to look through human suffering in the excuse of international relations that handicap our ability to go in and combat terrorists and save lives, something they never engaged to. The entire problem from the opening opposition, ladies and gentlemen, was that how do we actually handle these mercenaries? What should be the process through which we should go through to ensure there's more accountability or they're more efficient at their jobs? That's something, ladies and gentlemen, we believe is actually possible throughout the course of the debate. But the principal idea from the opening government, ladies and gentlemen, the entire idea that whether or not you should limit your ability to cross boundaries, to bypass those red tapes, bypass those laws that you believe is supposed to protect those individuals, but those terrorists, ladies and gentlemen, do not abide by those laws, are not bounded by those red tapes, are not bounded by the bureaucracy that states have to go through. And in particular situations, ladies and gentlemen, it's important that we as a state, we as a nation who cares and understands sufferings on that particular level, ladies and gentlemen, have that avenue and have that ability to go in and create an active change that can be done at the point of time. We can actually go in and stop the direct relationship that that states have when they go into other countries in the form of outright military intervention. The political mandates that come up, ladies and gentlemen, let that be the Republicans or the Democrats, as the political narrative within that particular country changes, the vote bank changes, a lot of things are at stake, right? But ladies and gentlemen, that one individual life that could have been saved in the Middle East, or that one individual life that could have been saved in Pakistan, gets cut off in that particular scenario, ladies and gentlemen, something that they never engaged to. Let's understand, ladies and gentlemen, how do these individuals essentially work? We tell you that let that be the state or let that be the corporations. At the end of the day, these mercenaries are individuals. A lot of money is being spent on them, right, ladies and gentlemen? Let's realize that they have to go through years of rigorous training. Let that be in that particular corporation. They have to shoot at targets every other day, make sure that they hit the target, and if they don't, then they don't get selected. That's as simple as that, ladies and gentlemen. What happens on a further strength? We also tell you, ladies and gentlemen, there are also periodic tests that they have to go through. Ladies and gentlemen, they have to graduate from one level to the other to understand how those particular situations play out. Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that they obviously do not go through the Navy and all that particular, ladies and gentlemen, but what we essentially tell you that they do understand how to react to pressure situations at the point of time they go in and carry out a particular assassination that we essentially believe is important. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, in that point of time, when you train them through those years, we essentially equip them with the ability to go in and confront the terrorists that organize in those particular areas, and we tell you that's particularly problematic. Ladies and gentlemen, let's understand this particular idea from the opening government. The stature and nature of conflicts has changed drastically as we have progressed through decades, right? We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, for far too long we have assumed that only under public paradigm of patriotic trained individuals can we go on to save and protect the sovereignty of our country or those beyond, right? We essentially tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that narrative needs to change. Why? Because essentially, when it comes to religious extremism, ladies and gentlemen, it has transformed drastically as well. We tell you that from the bloodthirsty Taliban that essentially went in and killed anyone who did not abide by the philosophy, it has turned more political in the form of ISIS and whatnot. We tell you that conflicts continuously changes and the way you actually need to get to them changes as well. And we tell you the point of time you allow those bureaucratic red tapes to exist, you limit your ability to go in and confront them in that particular ground, and essentially tell you that is problematic. Something that is not exclusive, ladies and gentlemen, it does not bring in any exclusive harm to the existing status quo. Before moving on, yes.
Yeah, but at the point when the confrontation that you create in that situation is actually going to create more harm, i.e. they are acting out war crimes or they are acting out of line, why is that a benefit for yourself?
The entire idea of how we only use dehumanized individuals, people who have gone and screwed up before, we'll be sending them back to wars, is outright hilarious. We tell you that those will not be sent to wars. Again, those who has failed in the military, those who has gone on to wars, and ladies and gentlemen, brought on a dishonor and disgrace to their country, we are not going to send them outright into war to protect the sovereignty of individuals and to save human lives. Obviously not. Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you the selection procedure obviously is going to take under consideration the mental stress, the amount of skills you need to shoot from a particular distance. When it comes to snipers, maybe the air pressure or everything that needs to be taken under consideration the point of time you shoot individuals. When it comes to understanding in what particular situations you can actually go in and engage, calculation of human casualty that you have to go to the point of time you engage in that particular military camp, ladies and gentlemen, all of this needs to be taken into consideration. That can easily be done in that particular scenario where we allow these private corporations to exist, ladies and gentlemen. Efficiency can be ensured, but the greater debate in this, ladies and gentlemen, in this house is when should we limit individuals' ability to go in and respond, or states' ability to go in and respond just because they're mercenaries, just because they are an operator outside the state. Yes.
Whereas you're involved in the army, in the official army, your psychology is being observed and your aggressive impulse are being observed for years, for 2 years, 3 years. While you're trained in a private company, nobody can observe the evolution of your psychology.
That's an assumption. You can actually make them go through those years and train them as well. The only difference that we have in this particular scenario, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the entire motive when it comes on the nationalistic paradigm is that you have to protect your country. There are certain rules you have to abide by. There are certain ideologies that you cannot let go of regardless of whatever scenario that you go into. We tell you that these ideals and patriotic line of thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, yes, that's ideal and that's something we should all respect. But we tell you that situations change. And at that point of time, when you have to make that critical decision, do you have to take away your ability to go in and integrate just because of the fact that they're mercenaries, just because of the fact that it creates bureaucratic pressure to your country in the long run? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the point of time a new administration, even within America or the EU comes in, ladies and gentlemen, the way that they attacked, for example, ISIS, right? The way that France responded, it was very much dependent on what has happened to them in the very recent past, ladies and gentlemen. We cannot act unless something an act of aggression has been done already. But we tell you that this sort of can be done within the status quo. We tell you that yes, JSOC exists, covert operations exist, but it's very different than mercenaries, ladies and gentlemen, in the form of dirty wars and whatnot. We have essentially bypassed what they have gone through, and we have understood, ladies and gentlemen, that when it comes to illegal wars and whatnot, it can happen under either paradigm. It's not exclusive to our debate. Covert operations already happen, let that work or let that fail. But when it comes to mercenaries, ladies and gentlemen, the essential benefit that you add, the essential idea that you equip yourself with the entire idea that you can walk away from these bureaucracies, that you can walk away from the essential burden that you have to bear as a state, we believe equips you to combat a greater harm. It's a comparative, ladies and gentlemen. Should we let go of that to save more lives, to ensure that more people live happily? Thank you.
Thank you. And apologies. Can I just check, are you Fardeen or Tazeen?
He was passing.
Okay, great. I'd like to invite the Deputy Opposition Leader.
Are you ready? Okay, so two things in this speech. Firstly, why we think war crimes and the conduct of war all gets worse when we start using private military contractors and mercenaries. Secondly, why we think conflict itself is more likely to happen, why we think that's a bad thing. Before that, our stance and rebuttal, just kind of framing this round. So just remind yourself, we do not stand for using these mercenaries, but the money they want to use on mercenaries, we're happy just to use to expand the national army. If they care about, increasing our capacity to fight these wars, yeah, we'll just do that. We're happy to do that. So my question for open government is, why do you need these mercenaries? The only reason we've really been given is that it's bureaucratic to use your national army. So my question is, okay, so are you guys just going to use them without any kind of democratic votes or anything like that? Are you just going to have executive powers to use these mercenaries? I mean, there'll be enormous backlash when you do that. It'll be seen completely unfair, undemocratic, and they'll be seen as in that country completely illegitimately by the people in that country. But the second thing I'm going to say is, if you do have less bureaucracy on your side of the house, and my second point, I'm going to explain why that's a really bad thing, why it's really bad to have no democratic oversight of these forces. And also I'll say, on the national armies that we can train, we can have lots of training for them, we can make them go through months and months of process and so on. We already have national armies with experience and so on. We don't think they've really shown us anything about these mercenaries which makes them necessarily better. But let's talk about the two things I want to talk about. Sorry, one thing in rebuttal before I go to my 2 points. On politicisation, they say it's less politicised, it's seen as mercenaries. Look, firstly, they're still seen as being sent there by, for example, the United States of America. So it's still seen as the US invading your country, but now they're just using mercenaries. That didn't stand. But then they told us that the population on the ground will see these mercenaries there, they're following the call of duty, it's professional. No, it's the complete opposite on their side of the house. These mercenaries are seen there for profit. They're making money out of the misery and suffering that you're inflicting on my country through your invasion. That's more likely to be backlashed against than a US soldier who's seen to be there because he's loyal to his country, he's got an obligation to his country, he's just trying to protect his family, he's just trying to protect his state, he's just defending American values. He's probably more likely that person will be accepted by the community, say in Baghdad or in cities in Afghanistan, than a PMC or mercenary who's seen there just to make money and it's like a cruel, cold job. So we think that's good. That's a win actually for our side of the house. Let's talk now about the two things we wanted to bring: war crimes and why conflicts are now more likely. Because we get no characterisation from the government bench about who these mercenaries are. And I could give you lots of good, reasonable explanations of who these mercenaries are. I'll just do a few more. Notice mercenaries are not working for their national army. Why are they not working for their national army? Recognise it's a good thing to work for your national army because you get lots of state pension, you get lots of benefits, you get lots of protections late into your life, you get good salaries, you get respect in society. Why would I not fight for my national army then? Well, there are two reasons. First is that after the Cold War, the US, the UK, Russia, they all reduced the size of their militaries. Why? Because they weren't really seen to be needed anymore. Right? The Cold War was over, we're now in a time of peace. So what militaries did, they laid off lots of their workforce. Who did they lay off? They probably laid off the soldiers who weren't the best soldiers. They laid off the ones who weren't the best fighters, the most experienced, and so on. So these poorer quality soldiers are the ones who tend to fill the ranks of academia and these kind of private military contractors around the world. The second thing about these soldiers is that they're more likely to be psychologically damaged than new soldiers who come into the army. Why is that? And I can give you reasons. These people have probably already fought in several theatres of war. They've seen their friends die. They've seen their comrades die. They've been dehumanised by that war. It's much more likely, therefore, they'll go out and commit revenge attacks. They go back to Afghanistan, they go back to Iraq, because they want to get revenge for the suffering that was inflicted upon their comrades. That doesn't happen on our side of the house, because when using the national army, you've often got newer recruits who are being trained. They don't have that 10, 15 years of war damage, which comes from being in a conflict zone over and over. So that's why these mercenaries are more likely to commit those kinds of war crimes, more likely to commit those kinds of atrocities. A few more things on these war crimes. Two things to note here. It's very hard to stop them. Why? Because you get very little observation and accountability of these individuals. Why? Because journalists and human rights observers cannot go into the worst parts of conflict. It's just simply too dangerous. So it's really hard to keep tabs on what these PMCs and these mercenaries are doing. And secondly, note, the monetary incentive of working as a mercenary is not enough in these cases to stop you from committing abuses. Why? Because for working as a mercenary, you've often already had your military career in the past, and you're just working for a PMC to make some money at the end of your career, because it's like a quick buck that you can get. So you don't really care if you might get you don't care if you might get fired by your company. You don't care because you could work for another company. You go move from, say, South Africa to India and work for a PMC there. It's really easy to move around. So there's very little control we can have over them through our monetary mechanisms. We think that soldiers often have a strong loyalty to their country. They don't want to go against the orders they've been given. They don't want to hurt the reputation of the United States of America, for example. They're much more likely to curb themselves, not commit such abuses. No response from their side else. The Abu Ghraib scandal was committed primarily by people who worked as mercenaries, for all the reasons that Annika told you. Notice also, look, the last time we used mercenaries in Iraq, we saw the Blackwater scandal in Baghdad, where 17 unarmed Iraqi civilians were shot dead by Blackwater employees. Why? Because these were the exact type of mercenaries that we've talked about. They're people who'd been in several conflicts of war, they were radicalised by that war, and they saw Iraqis in police uniforms, and they saw them shooting at them, and they thought, we're not having this, we're committing revenge, and we're going to shoot them down, shoot them dead. That's less likely to happen on our side of the house, when your soldiers are more disciplined, more likely to follow their orders, and so on. Before I carry on, I'll take a PR, yeah.
So
state has an incentive to be accountable for the drone strikes they carry out which kill unarmed civilians, they also have an accountability to make sure another Blackwater scandal never happens. We'll never choose the risky loose cannon options, but the ones that bring about the efficient solution, because that's why we chose them on the first place. The extra value that can be derived from going into Azerbaijan and stuff
We've
is
given
needed.
you systematic reasons why the people who work as mercenaries are more likely to commit those things in the first place. You've given no characterization of who these mercenaries are. You said efficient lots of times. Give us no characterization of who these people are. We've given you realistic, real-world examples of who these mercenaries are, how they operate, and why it's going to be so much worse on your side of the house. Why is conflict more likely on their side of the house? Look, we think war and conflict is generally a bad thing. Why? Because military interventions tend to lead to long-run backlash against the countries. Civilians die in huge numbers in war. What comes after a war is often worse than what was there before, as we're seeing in Iraq. Now, we see a massive radical terrorist organisation. I think some would say might be in a better world. I think there are a very, very small number of cases where we support going to war. The two examples I can think of, maybe the first Gulf War and the NATO intervention in Kosovo, where we have a clear actor we do not support, and we can, with reasonable success, get rid of that actor. Notice, in these cases, there are clear public support for those wars, and also we're willing to see those conflicts through. So democratic populations do vote for going for war, they do support their soldiers going to fight the war. Even if soldiers are coming back dead, they still support those wars. They can see there's such clear cases. On their side of the house, now war becomes much more likely, because now the public cares less. Oh, it's just mercenaries dying, we don't care so much about that. We're going to see much more instances now of more conflicts. States not having to go through the processes of convincing the public that this is a war worth fighting. They'll have much more easy access to fighting war. And states often do want to, for example, capture resources, as we saw in the Middle East. That's now more likely on your side of the house. And it's a very regressible thing. On our side of the house, we have soldiers who are more likely to be cared about by their populations, and so on. That leads less war in the world today. I think that's a good thing, because war is so uniformly bad, more often than not. Look, we told you two things in this debate. We told you, firstly, why war crimes and the conduct of war are made so much more likely when you're using mercenaries rather than the National Army. I've also just told you why we're going to see more conflicts in the first place, which is pretty much a bad thing. And if there are really bad cases where we want to stop a fight, we will go there and we will use our soldiers, so that's fine. So yeah, for all those reasons, very happy to oppose.
Thank you, Honorable Panel. On Closing Government today, we're going to tell you that the ban on mercenaries from the Geneva Convention is one that comes from outdated conceptions of international politics and the nature of armed conflict as it exists in the current world. We're going to explain two things. Firstly, how the use of mercenaries reduces the incidence of unjust wars generally. And secondly, how the use of mercenaries in these circumstances actually make those interventions more humane. So on the first point, I want to talk about how we reduce unjust wars on Closing Government. Firstly, I tell you that there's going to be the reduction of a large military-industrial complex that results from having the budget ascribed and set aside every year in the amounts of hundreds of billions of dollars for it, right? And this is especially true given opening opposition's willingness to expand that budget by whatever amount we would have had on the mercenaries, right? It is a fact of government that when you set aside a certain amount of money for the use of your army, when you devote a large amount of contracts to developing equipment, that equipment just tends to be used in these particular cases, right? So we tell you that why mercenaries are a better model of armed conflict moving forward is that they allow the reduction during the budgeting stage of government to say we want a smaller standing army, and if there is a particular cause that we want to devote our mercenaries to, that is a cause for which we would be willing to fight, but there's no monetary pressure because you spent the money, politically speaking, to use what you've already spent your monies on, right? And we think that this addresses kind of, in part, I want to rebut their arguments about how mercenaries are seen as pecuniary, and that in contrast, American soldiers are seen as more honorable because they're defending American values, right? And the problem with this is that I don't think that people, in the cases where the military interventions are happening, particularly care for the American values that are causing the hundreds of deaths among the civilians, right? So the really important weighing that happens here is then what side reduces the overall incidence of armed conflict, given that there are probably pretty similar perceptions of whether someone's paid as part of a firm or someone's paid as part of a country. So the next thing that I want to talk about, because recognize that this round is focused really only on cases where there's already a large standing army, right, is that this has the effect of deterring aggression overall in the world, right? If Ukraine is able to receive help from well-established military firms that have expertise in stopping, for example, Russian aggression, we tell you that that aggression is much less likely to happen in the first instance. But also just in cases of other places that need intervention that necessarily won't get it on opposition, we can talk about for the cases of where opening government says bureaucracy stops it. But I also just think the other effect is that people are generally reticent to commit lives to those particular cases, but are more willing to spend on the equipment. But in these particular cases where you actually need armed forces to, for example, stop Boko Haram or stop the Rwandan genocide in the past, they're much more likely to actually get that because there's no longer the idea of you were sacrificing our own civilians in these cases, in cases where the equipment doesn't actually become useful in those cases. So the second large class of arguments that I want to talk about is how we get more humane wars on our side of the house. Opening opposition focuses solely on the nature of who are these mercenaries being hired, while ignoring the fact that the mercenary forces themselves have a very strong incentive to be self-policing because of the repeat interaction, right? The problem with the status quo and the implementation of mercenary forces such as Blackwater, which actually are on the borderline of international laws about what constitutes a mercenary, right, is not that mercenaries have been used too much in up to the status quo, but rather that they haven't been institutionalized to the extent that the regulations needed to make them a more positive force within conflicts can make that possible, right? So firstly, I just want to deal with the individual member incentives a little bit now and then at the end of this argument. So firstly, just mercenaries have oftentimes far less ethnic motivations for carrying out armed conflict in the first place and are rather incentivized by the monetary contributions that they're getting, right? And we say that this is a better model of conflict because there's no hatred of the other side's civilians. And we say that abuses are overall much more likely to go down, right? This is also especially true to happen because a lot of the times, in the absence of mercenaries, when you need to recruit large numbers of volunteers or you need to justify a draft to your people, we tell you that the way to justify that on the political level is the otherization and the inflammation of the ethnic tensions that exist in the first place. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the necessary resources, and this allows a way around that discourse that causes the ultimate violence and suffering that happens in these particular cases. Sure thing.
What makes you hire an individual over other individual when you're hiring people to serve in your military business?
So I think the problem with this, it focuses too much on what the actual mechanism for hiring is, but ignores the actual oversight mechanism that would exist as a result of having this international body having some kind of regulation, right? So on this point specifically, the actual way a mercenary would work as a result of having repeat interactions on the international sphere is that if they're the kind of firm that is very lax on screening its soldiers for PTSD, or if they're the kind of firm, no thank you, that is very does a very poor job at caring for its soldiers' mental health during the conflict and leads to a lot of abuses that are publicized in the media that recognize that creates a giant diplomatic and economic cost for the country that actually has this in the first place, right? So when a firm establishes a reputation as being one that has very poorly trained mercenaries or mercenaries that are not psychologically sound, that means it has a lot of incentives on the hiring stage to make sure that the mercenaries are covered in that particular cases, right? And so we think that there's an additional layer here, not even just on the firm thinking about how it deals with all the potential countries, but an actual lever for other countries to pull when they say this is not a firm that should be engaging in international conflict in the future, right? The problem is when countries such as the United States, in the example of Abu Ghraib, have a lot of abuses. By the way, the 5 soldiers that were captured on camera perpetrating those abuses were American soldiers, not Blackwater in that particular case. We say that the U.S. there are 2 problems. Firstly, the U.S. has an incentive to reach out and shield their own forces in order to protect their diplomatic powers, and no thank you. And secondly, the other issue with this particular case is that there's no form of recourse, right? Like, a lot of countries really just can't sanction the United States for having that kind of abuse in their military conflicts, but they do have a lever in terms of sanctioning specific firms, right? They say, I will not engage with this particular firm when I hire in the future, or I say to the United States, you shouldn't hire this firm, or there will be repercussions, right? And that kind of threat is a lot more credible because the cost to the United States is a lot more marginal in saying we're replacing this firm because of the backlash it has versus we're fundamentally restructuring our army, when we think that these kinds of regulatory mechanisms are the kind that would make war with mercenaries more humane. So in the remaining time, some outstanding rebuttal about the nature of how they're going to get better employees and better mercenaries on this house. Firstly, a lot of times, it's not just ex-soldiers that are being recruited by these mercenaries. They're people with specific skills, right? Specific counterinsurgency skills, or knowledge of how to use particular equipment, such as IEDs, or the local knowledge of how the terrain works in response to asymmetrical warfare. And we tell you that in the long run, when these are more effective interventions being carried out, there are less grievances and less violence perpetrated on both sides. But I think the other thing, just in terms of broadly thinking about how they're getting, how the screens and how we're going to be mitigating the mental effects, we tell you that we're going to be getting better treatment within armed forces in the first place because of competition, right? If you can decide whether or not you want to work for a mercenary company or you want to work for your nation's armed forces, now there's a second player in the market that says, if I'm not getting PTSD treatment or I'm getting like multiple tours, I'm not going to be working for you. For those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, and now I invite the opposition
In my speech, I will prove you three major things. First of all, there is no efficiency here, as first half tried to prove you today. Second of all, there will barely be an improvement in how we expend resources, and that, like my extension, will talk about how life is not a resource, is not tradable, and even if we are losing some resources, we should not devaluate the value of life at the end of the day. But first thing first, I will tackle the two major points from the first half. But let's see what's the perception of an invader after this motion has been proposed. How will I perceive the one who comes into my country and ruins my life? Will I care that the soldier speaks Algerian, Romanian, or will I care more about the uniform he uses? Who represents, what flag does he represent, or who declared the war that he is fighting for? So at the end of the day, we believe that people, when are inside in a war, need an identity of the enemy. And we believe that most of the time, the identity of the enemy is the country that declares the war, and on both sides, the country like US and so on and so forth, the one that hurts is the one who will be portrayed as the invader. So at the end of the day, all the hate that they try to say that contributed to ISIS, that contributed to Boko Haram, stays up. Second of all, we believe that efficiency is not tackled by this motion. Why? Because first of all, we don't want countries to involve in war. Because at the end of the day, we see wars being intrinsically bad. They destroy lives, they do casualty, they destroy the local society, and it makes most of the time a country hard to rebuild. What we are making by this motion, we are making wars easier to be made. Why? Because you don't have any more. You don't need anymore to involve your own resources into that conflict. You can involve other people's resources, and it will be easier for you to play with other people's lives. Okay, so. Second of all, we believe that for any country, is there enough harm if there's enough harm that it's being done by an enemy, that country will intervene against an enemy. So we don't see any country staying aside and letting a society being destructive and not intervening if there is an actual need of intervention. But we want to leave that kind of intervention as a last resort measure. And third but not least, we believe that rich countries have powerful military, and they will replace it with powerful mercenaries, and poor countries have poor economical condition and will not be able to hire powerful mercenaries. So at the end of the day, we're not making the war more efficient, we are letting it in the same way. Okay, now tackling the second half, we believe that budget expenses will not lower. Why? Because there's a thing called soft power. We believe that soft power depends on showing how powerful you are, how much power you can expose in case of a conflict. So at the end of the day, if you do not have a contract with a mercenary service, or if you don't have big weapons to show to use as a deterrent against possible actors, you will not have soft power. So at the end of the day, we see that countries are more prone to still invest in this kind of things, either in contacting preemptive mercenary contracts, or having a constant service with a mercenary for them to show that they are powerful. And we believe that the big spenders that are actually tackled by this side are the ones who need a soft power, like US, like Russia. We see Russia showing their weapons on the street constantly. This is how they act, and this is a need they will use. No, thank you. So at the end of the day, we see no reduction in this area. But let's see what we believe it's important. We believe that life is not tradable. So at the end of the day, let's see how people enroll in the current world, and what are the reasons for which they do this. We believe that besides what they've said, like the first half said, we bring you 4 more reasons. The people want to protect their nations. People want to make money. People want vindication. People might want to go there for patriotism. All these things, all these reasons come for different appeal to different social classes. Either you are poor, either you are rich. You'll both want to go there to represent your country because you're a patriot. What we tell you today is that we are creating a shift of paradigm. Why? Let's see how will industry work afterwards. Like the mercenary industry will push people, will advertise these kind of things, will try to make it as appealing as possible to be able to provide the services that countries need. Don't you agree?
No, I don't, because when the national army has to compete with private firms, that means offering better conditions in the national army, such as, for example, protecting women from sexual assault, which is a huge problem in the status quo. Isn't that true?
As you've tried to tell us today, you've just said that companies have to have a decent moral ground to be able to be contracted by a state. So at the end of the day, population will still be against companies that don't protect women, but will not be against companies which put the price that I ask for me to be hired by your service. So what I'm trying to tell you today, that these companies will price the most the individual who asks the least for its service. So if I ask less money than you, I will be the one hired. Why is this important? Because there is more prone that people from disenfranchised backgrounds, people who are in greater need for money, people from like parts of the globe that are willing to be paid less for this action, which value their life less, are more prone to be engaged by these businesses. When we believe that taking advantage of vulnerable people is really harmful, because at the end of the day, we do not believe that people should be coerced into giving their own life just because they have failed the lottery of life, just because they've done some poor life decision. So we believe that by doing this, we are willing to sacrifice more lives because there's no efficiency, and we believe that these businesses will not value the life intrinsically, but more like the resources they are giving. So they don't necessarily care about these people, and they will value more the lives of vulnerable people. So we believe this being fraud. Moreover, we believe that at the end of the day, the individual values less the resource he has to invest in this rather than the life of an acquaintance. So what I'm saying is that I'm willing rather to pay some money for you to go to war than leaving my brother, my sister, or my mother suffer because of my loss of going to war. So we believe that people are less prone to intervene against a war, are less prone to say no to a war, because there's no longer a friend of mine who's losing his life. It is a far away acquaintance that is losing its life. For all these reasons, I beg you to oppose.
Thank you, and now invite the government.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On the opposition side of the House, any country that has the ability to exercise brute force through their national traditional army is able to prevent any other country and the international system at large from exercising pressure on the quality of the prosecution of the war. On our side of the House, the economic incentives that exist when you institutionalize the provision of troops for international conflict solves not only the mitigation brought up by side opposition, but also the harms in the status quo that exists with poorly operated national armies. So with that said, I think this debate basically boils down pretty simply into two areas. So first of all, what type of conflict is actually engaged in by nations? And then second of all, once conflict is begun, how is it characterized? How violent is it? What is the treatment of civilians? I think on both counts, we very persuasively demonstrated to you that side government is winning this debate. So first of all, what we hear from opening opposition on what wars are fought is that it's easier for the domestic population to accept the death of mercenaries rather than their own countrymen, so you get more war. So I think the problem with this is that they don't actually engage in how political leaders justify war to the domestic population. So if it's the case that you, as a government official, have an incentive to engage in warfare, you will find the rhetoric that is necessary to justify that war to your domestic population. On their side of the House, when you can't hire private contractors, all that means is you use more nationalistic rhetoric, more aggressive rhetoric, in order to make sure that your countrymen do accept these deaths. So we think that those sort of defensive conflicts exist on both sides of the House. The meaningful difference are the humanitarian conflicts that we don't think they actually get prosecuted on the opposition bench, because the place where members of a nation are least likely to accept the death of their fellow citizens is when it isn't directly in defense of their country. It can't be justified with nationalism. It's merely to stop a genocide in another country, to protect a political transition, or to enforce human rights. On our side of the house, because people on a principled level support these types of war, but merely don't like the cost in human life of their countrymen, when the government can justify these policies by saying, all we're doing is outsourcing this, we're just providing the funding and the oversight, it is far more likely that we intervene in the types of conflicts that opening government says are so unquestionably worth intervening in. So I think it's very clear that we intervene in the correct types of wars on our side of the house. But second of all, on just the nature of the quantity of wars, I think we are also winning because we get fewer wars. I'll take you after this for two reasons. First of all, because we have a smaller military-industrial complex, right? So when you don't constantly have a big pool of money available for military, but rather you have to provision it for specific conflicts, it is less likely that you have a constant capturing of the political class to advocate for war. But second of all, we deter aggression into countries that don't have standing armies. So it's not the case, as closing opposition contends, that Ukraine is responsible for funding PMCs, but other countries that want to prevent the extension of Russian power can now provide funds so that they buy private military contractors and prevent the intervention in the first place. I'll take opening.
So private military contractors have no reason to have the oversight mechanisms you talk about because they're very costly, and crucially, there's very little chance of human rights abuses being caught because governments cover money.
Yeah, I think this is
ridiculous. Journalists and human rights observers in war zones, which is why it's so dangerous. That's why we get the war crimes we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think this is absolutely false and just shows a stunning lack of engagement with the arguments we've been giving to you. The incentive they have to do this is profit incentive, right? We create a competitive market in which you only get hired if you have this type of oversight. Second of all, because we actually institutionalize this practice, we force national governments to have the type of oversight, right? So if you have the ability to know how long somebody has been fighting in your national army and discharge them when they have PTSD, they haven't given us a single reason why you similarly wouldn't be able to apply this oversight in hiring a private military firm. Great, so that transitions very nicely to the second area of analysis, which is how the wars are prosecuted once you actually undertake them. I think we have much better incentives on our side of the house. I'm going to walk you through a couple steps. So first of all, what is the motivation for conflict in the first place? On our side of the house, it's profit incentive, not defense of a homeland or nationalism. So I think that's really important. When they talk about your relationships with civilians, it is not the case that on our side of the house, you see them as antagonistic or not necessarily otherized, right? You are simply there to do a job, and you don't necessarily have the same emotional reasons for wanting to take revenge, for wanting to treat them as enemies. But second of all, I think Edwin uniquely explains to you why these companies are repeat players in the system, right? So you are only ever going to get hired again if you make sure that you prevent this type of conflict, this type of abuses. Sure.
So we were very specific. It's hard to identify when abuses happen in war. So why is a private military company going to put so much investment and effort trying to stop my soldiers doing that when it's not going to get caught?
Yeah, so I just don't think that's true, right? So we know about abuses in the Abu Ghraib prison because there are incentives from the domestic population in the countries to publicize this. The reason in the status quo we don't know about abuses is because they impugn the credibility of the government rather than simply being able to respond to them by firing an entire company and using a competitive marketplace. So we know about more war crimes on our side of the house. So I think clearly, first of all, we get less violence because the reasons for engaging in conflict are necessarily less antagonistic. Second of all, who is fighting the wars? We hear from opening opposition this uniform characteristic that they're just ex-army individuals who have been fighting for too long. First of all, when you can hire more people through PMCs, the National Army doesn't have to send people for as many tours, so you get less PTSD in the first place. But second of all, as Edwin tells you, because you're competing in a competitive marketplace, you actually have to treat mental conditions in the first place. But third of all, we also tell you that by institutionalizing this process and by competing in a competitive marketplace, people are forced to actually screen their employees and make sure that they're not prone to the types of abuses that are happening on their side of the house. Finally, what does oversight look like? Look, It is simply easier to fire a company and hire another one, or if you're another country, to pressure a government to do so, than it is to reform an entire military system that is ingrained in your culture and political structure. So not only do we get less abuses, but when they happen, we know about them more frequently and can handle them more effectively. Very proud to propose.
Thank you. I now invite Mr.
Ladies and gentlemen, what the opposition side of this debate has tried to explain to you is that it is very important to see war only as an extension of the politics of the state, and that when we talk about concepts which are in direct connection with international law, such as the sovereignty of a state, and war in itself represents an expression of international relationships, and it is very important to be kept like this and not to involve private agents. But why are we talking about this? First of all, as we have presented to you in our extension, we have tried to explain to you why it is very important not to see life as a trade and to keep the soldier as having a moral duty to participate in war and having this direct connection between the state and the military agent. We believe that, generally speaking, economical relationships between agents will look at the offer, and we will see that the people who are willing to engage in conflicts will be people who originate from poorer areas, from poorer countries. And we believe that this is a very dangerous aspect which should be definitely taken into consideration. We have seen that France, for example, in her past used mercenaries who originated from the former colonies, who originated from Algeria and Morocco, people who had very low standards and who were easily willing to risk their life and to get engaged in such activities without taking into consideration that it might risk their own lives and that further on they might produce further on more damage. And also, we believe that the training which is provided by a state cannot be replaced by a private agent. This has been tried to be tackled in this debate, and this is a very important issue which should be clarified. They have said that actually private sources are very competitive and they could improve the activity and the efficiency on the front. What we believe is that, by contrary, what a state provides during the training, which lasts for years, 2 years, 3 years. You have the conditions to observe the evolution of the psychology of a military and to analyze if he has aggressive tendencies and if he becomes influenced and if he has indeed post-traumatic disorders and stuff like that. And that is very important. Whilst when an anonymous company comes and offers you its services, you cannot actually say if indeed that person has the mental ability to actually engage in such a serious issue like war, which makes it all as well very dangerous. Now, further on, another consequences of the fact that we will trade basically with countries who are poor or with representatives of countries who originate from less developed countries is the fact that these people will be anonymous for us. They are not our soldiers, they are not an extension of our country, and they are not our brothers and our sisters, our fathers and all that, what we hear when we usually talk about war, which definitely has proven that it does affect the society in its whole. We have seen the United States of America having to retire from the Iraq and for other conflict areas because of social pressure, because of too many news of soldiers, of brothers and sisters, as people tend to talk about it, who died and who were very touched about these stories because they could empathize with them. Whilst what we believe is that people would empathize less with people who originate from different places, from different countries, with which they will not resonate with. Why we believe that will happen and the social pressure and the monitoring of society will diminish is that mercenaries are seen precisely, as the government says, as people who are willing to participate and who did that because they chose to do it. And people will judge you. People, if you will risk your life or if you will suffer some physical damage in war, people will judge you because you wanted to do it and you expressed your consent in order to make profit, which makes you more, makes a society less plausible to actually engage with you and empathize with you and determine through pressure, the state to be less offensive and to use these mechanisms less, as it happened in the United States, which, as we mentioned, eventually retired from the warfare with Iraq. We believe that states will have this natural tendency to be abusive, even if they use their own military, even if they use guerrilla or mercenaries. But what we believe is that as long as that soldier has this identity and is influenced by concepts as patriotism, and he represents basically the external politics of that state, we believe that this is easier to be held accountable, and the society will be more able to monitor the activity of these people than in the case of using mercenaries who are anonymous. Yes, please.
If the international community doesn't like the conduct of private military contractors in a war, they can place sanctions on the company and refuse to hire them themselves. Doesn't that give other countries more ability to control the conduct than they would of the entire US military?
Yes, of course. The problem is more likely in the scenario where the state actually becomes abusive, and wants to plans it to be abusive through mercenaries in the purpose of actually hiding its actions and hiding its international responsibility. And we have seen that happening. We have seen that happening maybe in Russia in its conflict with Ukraine. Russia denying its involvement in the conflict with Ukraine, and we do not know now who is accountable for that plane who was hijacked. And the inquiry seems to last for ages. So there are many problems which are raised by this. Now I would like to move on to the rebuttal and the issue to tackle the extension which was brought by the second government, which referred to basically saving resources and making the war more efficient because states would not invest in military. We believe that first of all, we believe that it would be a danger if private companies could have the capacity to replace the instruments, the army instruments which a state has. We believe that if there is a private company who has as many soldiers or many tanks, as many helicopters and all those instruments, and it could offer to the state this, we believe that this could represent a big danger for for national security and international relations. And moreover, we believe that in the case of money, when a soldier has the duty to fight, whereas a mercenary does not have the duty to fight, he will actually cost more, and the state will have to pay more for determining a mercenary to actually fight in a war. So these are reasons which make more possible for us which raise basically the costs of mercenaries and do not make plausible the argument which was brought by the second government. Now, for all these reasons, we beg you to oppose.